There is a single line in this dramatized account, written in a hand the whole world would know, on a page never meant for the public. To Catherine, the pieces we spoke about, she will know what they are for. Not to the Queen Consort, not to a daughter or a niece. To Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and that small, specific line, she will know what they are for, is the reason a private bequest became a public tremor. Because in this family, jewels are never just jewels. They are a language. They say who is trusted, who is next, who the crown believes in. And a grandmother, choosing her words carefully near the end, wrote a sentence that pointed straight past the present and into the future. Camilla's reaction is what everyone talked about. But the reaction was never the story. The line was, and the line said something no title could. Let me tell you how I come at this, because it changes what you should take from the next 20 minutes. I read the paperwork of legacy, the bequest lists, the inventories, the quiet handwritten notes that decide where a lifetime of objects goes when a life ends. It's not glamorous work. But a bequest is one of the most honest documents a person ever leaves, because it's written when there's no one left to perform for. What you give, and to whom, is the last true thing you say, and that is exactly why it tells you so much. So let me be honest with you before we go a step further, the way a lot of channels won't. This is a dramatized story. What's real is the foundation. The late Queen had an enormous personal collection of jewelry, and in this family those pieces genuinely carry meaning. Status, favor, continuity, passed down with intent between generations. That is well documented and true. But the specific line, the specific bequest, the specific reaction, that is interpretation. A story built on real ground, not a leak, not a copy of a real will, not a claim that anyone showed me anything. And I want to say one thing plainly, because a woman who is still living sits at the edge of this story. This is not a tale with a villain. Camilla's reaction, however I frame it, is the most human thing imaginable. To feel something when a symbol of belonging passes you by. That is not wickedness. That is being a person. And the Queen's choice, as I'll read it, wasn't an insult to anyone. It was an old woman thinking about the future of the thing she'd given her whole life to. Neither of them is a cartoon. And the cartoon version, the jealous rivalry, the catty snub, is exactly how everyone misses what this is really about. Because this was never a story about one woman being chosen over another. It was about a grandmother, near the end, quietly deciding where to point, and choosing to point at the future rather than the present. Keep that line in your head. She will know what they are for. We start with the jewels. Let's take the jewels seriously first, because people hear jewelry and think vanity, and that's a mistake. In most families, jewelry is sentiment, grandma's ring, passed down because you loved her. In this family, it is also infrastructure. The great pieces aren't personal property so much as tools of the institution, worn at state occasions, photographed on the world stage, loaded with history and meaning. When a royal woman wears a particular tiara or a particular brooch, she is not just accessorizing. She is being placed. The piece says, this is who she is now. This is the role she carries. This is the story the crown is telling about her. So when the late Queen's personal pieces were divided, in this account, it wasn't a matter of who liked what. It was a matter of who the future belonged to. Each significant piece is a small crown in its own right, and where it lands is a statement about where the institution is heading. Now picture the bequest in this telling, not the state jewels, which pass with the roll. The personal ones, the pieces we spoke about, the ones with private meaning, the ones a grandmother chooses deliberately for a specific person, and that line directs them not to the woman who currently holds the highest rank among the royal women, but to the younger one, the one whose whole life still lies ahead of her inside the institution, the one who will, one day, stand beside a king as queen herself. And here's the quiet power of that. The queen didn't have to say anything about Camilla at all. She simply had to name Catherine, and the naming did all the work. Choosing where something goes always, silently, chooses where it doesn't go. The bequest wasn't a rejection of anyone, it was an affirmation of someone. But affirmations, in a family this closely watched, cast long shadows. That is why one line on a private page could shake a nation's worth of commentary, not because it attacked, because it pointed. And in a family where every object is a signal, pointing at the future is the loudest thing you can do. But of course, jewels are just the visible part. What they stand for is the real object in this story, and that's where it stops being about carrots and starts being about the crown itself. Forget the stones for a second. I want to show you what they actually represent, because that's the real spine of this. Every significant royal jewel carries an invisible second meaning: continuity. It answers the quiet question the institution is always asking: who comes next? Who will carry the image of this monarchy into the years none of us will see? And a grandmother who spent 70 years being the image of it understood that question better than anyone alive. So the second object in this story isn't the jewels, it's the choice underneath them. A decision about the future. The pieces were Object 1, visible, valuable, arguable. What they symbolize is Object 2, invisible, and far more powerful, because in leaving them where she did, the queen wasn't distributing property, she was casting a vote. Think about what a bequest like this actually is. It's the one moment a monarch gets to reach past her own death and place a hand on the future. She can't choose who reigns, that's fixed by blood and law. But she can choose where her personal symbols land, and in choosing, she can say, without a single public word, "This is the one I trust to carry it forward. This is the face I want the world to see wearing my things when I'm gone." And that reframes everything about the so-called snub, because if the jewels are a vote for the future, then leaving them to Catherine rather than Camilla isn't a comment on Camilla at all. It's a comment on time. Camilla, in this reading, represents the present reign. Charles is queen, the here and now. Catherine represents the long future, the next reign and the one after that, the decades of image carrying still to come. A grandmother thinking about the survival of the institution would naturally point her most meaningful symbols at the person who has the most future left to carry them. That's not a rivalry. It's an old woman doing succession planning with the only tools she had left, a jewel case and a pen. Which is exactly why the reaction, when it came, was so widely misread. Everyone saw two women and assumed a contest. But there was no contest. There was a grandmother, a granddaughter-in-law, and a very long game that had nothing to do with who deserved what, and everything to do with what would still be standing in 50 years. Now let me argue against my own story, because you deserve it, and because the people who won't argue against themselves are the ones to trust least. Here's the strongest version of the other side. You could say I'm wrapping a plain slight in a pretty theory. That all this talk of votes for the future is just a nice way to avoid the obvious. That a woman who had spent 20 years as Charles's partner and finally become his queen was passed over for meaningful family pieces in favor of the younger, more popular in-law. And that no amount of succession planning philosophy changes how that would land, as a final, quiet message about who was really considered part of the innermost family and who never quite was. That's a fair argument, and I won't wave it away. There is something genuinely pointed about where meaningful jewels go, and it would be naive to pretend a person on the receiving end of a bypass wouldn't feel it as a verdict. If Camilla, in this account, felt a sting, that's not pettiness. That's the completely human response to a symbol of belonging landing somewhere other than your hands, at the end of a long road to acceptance. But watch what that argument assumes. It assumes the bequest was primarily about ranking the women, measuring who was more loved, more inside. And the whole case from the Queen's side is that it wasn't about the women at all. It was about the institution and its future. If that's true, then reading it as a snub is reading a succession decision as a personal one, hearing an insult in a sentence that was only ever about time and continuity. I can't tell you for certain which it was, because in this dramatized story both readings are sincerely available. That's what makes it real rather than a soap opera. Camilla's hurt would be genuine and fair, and the Queen's intent could be genuinely impersonal, about the crown, not the person. Both can be true. A choice can be entirely about the future and still wound someone in the present. Which is why the reaction didn't settle anything. It just revealed how differently a single line can be heard, depending on where you're standing when you read it. So let's talk about the reaction, because in this account, that's what turned a private page into a public conversation. It wasn't a scene. That's the tabloid version, and it's wrong. What shook Britain, in this telling, wasn't an outburst. It was something quieter and more telling, a stillness. The kind of silence that says more than shouting ever could. A woman reading a line, understanding exactly what it meant, and saying nothing at all. Because Camilla, whatever else you think of her journey, is not naive about this family's language. She has spent decades learning to read its signals. She would have understood, instantly, that the bequest wasn't an oversight. It was a sentence written with care by someone who chose every word. She will know what they are for. That's not the language of forgetting. That's the language of deciding. And the hardest part, in this account, is that there was nothing to push back against. You can argue with a person. You cannot argue with a dead woman's pen. The Queen's wishes are, by their nature, final and unarguable, and everyone in that family treats them as close to sacred. So whatever Camilla felt, there was no move to make, no appeal, no reversal, just the quiet fact of a choice that could never be undone, written by the one person whose choices no one would ever overrule. And picture the position that put King Charles in, a husband watching his wife absorb a message from his mother, a son who cannot question his mother's final wishes, and would not want to, caught, silently, between two women he loved and a decision he had no power to change, even if he'd wanted to. In this telling, he says nothing either, because there is nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. That's why it resonated so far. Not because of drama, but because of its finality. A whole nation of commentary tried to turn it into a rivalry, a winner and a loser. But the people closest to it seemed to have understood the truth. No one won anything. A grandmother made a choice about the future. A wife felt the weight of it. And a husband stood between them, unable to move either the past or the pen. And the reason the Queen made that choice, the real reason, beneath the jewels and the symbolism, is the thing I've been holding back. To understand why the Queen, in this account, would point her most personal symbols at Catherine, you have to understand what 70 years on the throne does to how a person thinks about time. Most of us plan for years. A monarch who reigned for 7 decades learned to plan for generations. She watched her own grandmother's world vanish, watched empires fall and media transform, and the whole idea of monarchy be questioned again and again. And she kept the institution alive through all of it, by never, ever thinking only about the present. Her entire genius was the long view. The willingness to make choices whose payoff she would never live to see. So when she thought about where her personal pieces should go, she wasn't thinking the way the rest of us would, about affection, about who'd been loyal, about balancing feelings. She was thinking the way she'd thought about everything for 70 years. What does the institution need? Who carries it best into the years I won't be here for? And the answer to that question, in this telling, was never going to be about the present reign. It was going to be about the reigns after. Catherine, in that light, isn't chosen because she's more loved. She's chosen because she's the future. the woman who will be photographed for the next half-century as the face of a modernizing crown, the mother of a future king, the bridge between the monarchy the Queen knew and the one she'd never see. Putting meaningful pieces in Catherine's hands is the Queen doing what she always did, investing in the long game over the short one. And there's a tenderness in it that the snub reading completely misses. She will know what they are for. That's not a cold administrative line, it's trust. It's a grandmother saying, in effect, I don't need to explain these to you, because you already understand what they mean and what they're asking of you. It's the highest compliment one custodian of an institution can pay another. You get it. You'll carry it right. That's not a woman snubbing her son's wife. That's a woman, near the end of the longest watch in modern history, quietly handing the next watch to the person she trusted to keep it. Which brings us to what everyone actually argues about. Was it fair to Camilla? And does fairness even enter into it? Let me be as fair to Camilla here as I've tried to be to the Queen's intent, because a story with only one sympathetic figure is a story that's lying to you. Because from where Camilla stands, in this account, none of that lofty succession planning makes the moment hurt any less. Consider her road, decades as the most criticized woman in Britain, a long, slow, painful climb toward acceptance that most people would have abandoned. And finally, actually becoming queen, the title, the role, the belonging she'd been denied for so long. And then, right at the moment of arrival, a quiet line that points the family's most meaningful personal symbols somewhere else, past her, to the next generation. That would sting anyone, and it would be wrong to pretend the sting is pettiness. It's the ache of someone who spent a lifetime trying to be fully let in, discovering that in the most intimate ledger of all, a grandmother's private bequests, she was, in a sense, treated as the present rather than the future, as a chapter rather than the continuing story. And here's the genuinely tragic part. She may be right, and the Queen may be right, at the same time. The Queen's choice can be entirely about the institution's future and completely impersonal, and Camilla can still, fairly, feel it as one more reminder that some doors in this family only ever open so far. Both things can be true. A decision aimed at 50 years from now can still land as a wound today. So when this story ends with jewels in Catherine's hands and stillness on Camilla's face, don't read it as the popular woman beating the unpopular one. Read it as a collision between two kinds of truth: the institution's need to bet on the future, and a person's need to finally, fully belong. The Queen served the first, Camilla lived the second. Neither was wrong. And the reason the Queen chose the future anyway, even knowing surely that it would land hard on the wife her son loved, is the last thing worth sitting with. So let me finally say the thing this whole story has been circling. Why would the Queen, who surely knew how it would feel, still point her most personal pieces at Catherine instead of Camilla? Because she wasn't leaving jewels. She was leaving instructions about who to believe in. That line, "She will know what they are for," isn't really about jewelry. It's a message to the whole family, written to be understood after she was gone. This is the one I'm backing to carry the image of this monarchy forward. When you wonder, in the hard years ahead, who embodies what we are, look here. I already decided. Think about what a gift that is, and what a burden. The Queen couldn't choose the next monarch. That's fixed. But she could choose where to place her personal seal of trust, and she placed it on the woman who will spend the next 50 years being photographed as the crown's public face. In doing so, she gave Catherine something no title could: the late Queen's own, unambiguous confidence. A quiet inheritance of belief that will steady her through every future storm. Whenever the world doubts Catherine, there will always be this: the Queen chose her, on purpose, with her own pen. And that's why it had to be pointed at the future, even at the cost of a present wound. A vote of confidence only matters if it's placed where the long road still runs. Spent on the present, it's a kindness. Spent on the future, it's a foundation. The Queen, thinking as she always did in generations, spent it on the foundation. So the jewels that shook Britain were never really about Camilla, or even really about Catherine as a person. They were the Queen, doing her last and most characteristic act, taking the long view, one final time, and quietly telling the future who she trusted to carry it. Whether that was fair to the wife left holding the present, I go back and forth, but I don't think it was a snub. I think it was the most serious compliment the longest reigning monarch in British history knew how to give. Not, "I love you most," but, "I trust you with what comes next." So here's my honest verdict, and then a question, and then I'll let you go. Everyone saw a rivalry. Almost no one saw the vote, and the vote was the whole thing. The jewels were just the one place you could actually see a grandmother, near the end, reaching past her own death to point at the future she believed in, and trusting one person to understand what the pointing meant. Strip away the drama, if you like. Doubt the line, doubt the private page, take only what's real. A vast personal collection, a family where jewels carry meaning and continuity, and a monarch famous for always thinking in generations. Even the plain version tells you the same thing this story does, that in this family, where things go says who is trusted with the future, and a choice like that will always, quietly, cast a shadow over whoever it points away from, no matter how impersonal the intent. Nobody in this is a monster. Not the granddaughter-in-law who received a vote of confidence she never asked for, not the wife who felt a symbol of belonging pass her by at the very moment she'd finally arrived, and not the grandmother who did the only thing 70 years on the throne had taught her to do, serve the institution's future, even when it cost someone she loved in the present. The only real antagonist here is time itself, the fact that a crown must always be planning for the reign after next, and that planning for the future always, unavoidably, leaves the present feeling like a chapter that's closing. So here's my question, and I mean it, because I read the replies. If you were the Queen, if you could place one last vote of confidence, knowing it would steady the future but wound the present, where would you have pointed it? At the person who'd waited a lifetime to belong? Or at the future who'll carry it longest? Because she could only choose one. Tell me below. Not for the algorithm. Because underneath the palace, this is really a question about legacy. What you leave, to whom, and what your last choices say about what you believed in most. The line was written, and it could never be unwritten. And the hardest part wasn't the choice. It was that everyone else had to live with it.